Hey, everybody, I want to send you greetings on Martin Luther King Day and take a moment to share some thoughts about my family's relationship with Dr. King. Dr. King in 1967, in April of 1967, gave a famous speech in which he came out against the Vietnam War. He was breaking with the other civil rights leaders who were angry at him for leaving his lane. They said, we need to focus on civil rights. Half of the paratroopers units in Vietnam are black. We're sending black boys over there to die for freedoms in Vietnam and democracy that they do not have here at home. And he also said that the poverty program, which Lyndon Johnson and my uncle had launched, was being impoverished itself because of the cause of the Vietnam War. In 1967, he gave a beautiful speech, one of the best in American history, denouncing the war and calling on civil rights leaders to see this as part of their struggle. Almost a year to the day from when he gave that speech, he was murdered. And my father, who was running against the Vietnam War at that time, was going into a ghetto in Indianapolis, Indiana. And the sheriff warned him that he should not go, that people did not yet know that Martin Luther King's death. And the sheriff and the local city police believed they would lose control of the city when the black population learned of that. My father went alone anyway, and he climbed on a flatbed truck and he gave one of the best speeches of his life, an impromptu speech, telling the crowd for the first time that Martin Luther King had died. You can hear on the tapes an audible gasp from the people.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
And then he did something that he never had done before, which is he talked publicly about his brother's death. And he reminded the crowd that his brother was killed by a white man as well. And he called on the crowd to do something that was counterintuitive, which was to react peacefully. He quoted the Greek poet Aeschylus. And he said that our job now as Americans is to tame the savageness of man.
And make gentle the life of this world.
And that night, over 100 cities saw riots. The city where I was at that time was Washington, D.C., which was burned. Large parts of the city were burned almost to the ground, and that happened all over the country. The only major city that avoided rioting that night was Indianapolis, and people have attributed that to my dad's speech. And then when my dad died in 1968, 2 months later, after Dr. King, Coretta King was in the hospital with me and my siblings, Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles, and my father died. And then she was on the airplane with us, which took my father's casket back to New York, and she was on the train with us when we brought his body, the 7.5-hour train ride with 2.5 million people on the track. So I was 14 at that time when we brought his body to Washington, D.C., and Coretta King and the King family have remained ever since then very close to the Kennedy family. And it's an honor for me to be able to share a little bit of this story with you in a park that now is a memorial, one of the many memorials here in Atlanta to Dr. King. Here's a statue of Dr. King. I'll stand in front of it so you can see this beautiful statue. And behind me is the city of Atlanta. And it's a city that, you know, in In 1963, Dr. King had the March on Washington, which my father and my uncle partnered with him on, where they brought one of the largest crowds in our nation's history, and Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, which is probably, arguably, one of the best speeches ever done in our country. I'm grateful for our relationship with the King family, and I know my father and uncle were grateful that they got to participate with Dr. King because of his leadership in making this country, for the first time in its history, a true constitutional democracy.